How you going? I reckon you can help me out with a problem that I've got. You see, I went over to Europe in 2017 retracing some steps of key reformers to have an analysis of what was the cause, outcome, guts of the European Reformation. And I've come back with some questions. I should say from the outset, I've never been overseas before. Grown up my whole life in Australia. Most of that time spent in Queensland. Travelled a bit, but you know, I've lived under a rock, Ayers Rock you might call it, which incidentally was one of the only three places that most Europeans knew to ask from. Australia, you're from Melbourne, Sydney, Ayers Rock. Nobody is from Ayers Rock, okay? And people who are from it have a whole other name for it, peeps. It's called Uluru. Anyway, I was amazed to visit the homeland of my ethnic people, you know. I'm 200 years removed from Europe by my family. We've been in Australia doing our thing pretty much as long as white folks have. And you know, sometimes I envy the Indigenous Australians, their connection to country. Now, I'm not saying I haven't got a good rap in life. It's just growing up in a place where the bones of all of your known ancestors are. That's something. And when I went to Europe, I was expecting a sort of a feel like a homecoming, like, you know, like a call to country. And I did not get it. Europe is confrontingly violent, and the history of it is just riddled with bloodshed. It does throw into context for me a lot of what has happened on the Australian continent as far as European settlement and the limited amount of respect and engagement that European settlers had for indigenous cultures. Because the story of Europe is just a story of violence and blood. Anyway, what is the Christian Reformation? We were celebrating apparently the 500-year anniversary in 2017. This is because in the year 1517, Martin Luther purportedly kick-started the Reformation when he published his academic debate points, his 95 theses, which were largely suggesting reforms for the church and questioning a particular taxation system that they had in place at the time, indulgence, questioning the morals of an organisation. You can lose a lot of time focusing on the theology of the Reformation and the Reformers, those points as related to Christian doctrine that they were trying to make. They argued a lot themselves. It's no small subject, so even people who agreed that Reformation was required within the established system, they didn't agree on it. I think from contemporary perspective, it's more helpful to view the Reformation as the rise of nationhood. What we had was a change in system of government. So the Middle Ages is a purgatory, if you'll excuse the pun. It's this middle ground between the once great Roman Empire, which we can argue about whether that was great another time, and a lot of smaller squabbling kingdoms and city-states, and there was a lot of violence and instability, and people's notions of nationhood weren't developed at that time so well as their sense of religion, and I would say that a lot of the patriotism that is now currently invested in a person's country, their nation as their culture, was at that time invested in their faith, and so a reforming of the faith of peoples and making it more sensitive to the local requirements big things like putting the central document of the Christian faith, the scripture, into a language that people could understand because it was their native language. That was a big outcome from the Reformation. One should point that it can't have succeeded in making such radical social change without the aid of the printing press. So you could look at the Reformation also from the perspective of media studies and analyse to what effect being able to saturate a region with media through the printed pamphlets, etc., to what effect that could shape events, geopolitical events. Now, Luther receives, I guess deservedly so, a lot of attention so far as the Reformation goes, but he did not do it alone. There were plenty of characters around him, and if anything, Luther was hijacked by a growing sense of Germanic nationalism. He was literally hijacked on his way back from the Diet of Worms, where he was promised safe conduct after being denounced a heretic. He was literally hijacked by men from the local elector, a German prince, Frederick the Wise, and carried off to custody in Wartburg Castle, to which I have visited, and it was almost a farce to visit that place only with a view towards Martin Luther, who stayed there a matter of months. It was years, but just 2 or 3 years. It wasn't a long time that he was there. He did make a major achievement there, perhaps for the world, but certainly for his own culture. He translated a German New Testament, and he translated that from the Greek. Now, this flies in the face of a Latin translation, which had been long-standing, and one thing the Reformers did was they perhaps heavily influenced by the humanist academia of the time. We could talk about Erasmus. People give him a lot of credit for this push on the Devotio Moderna, or the modern way. They went back to the sources, particularly with scriptures, and in going back to original translations and skipping over some uses of words that had occurred in Latin, they gained fresh understanding of some of the core principles of their faith. Now, their faith was entwined with their society, so whilst they were re-examining their faith, they were actually re-examining their society. Luther made excellent use of the media. He posed for portraits and had a visual representation of himself that got out there. His words got out there, not always intentionally. Some of his stuff was printed without him. There was no copyright. People could just print and reprint his stuff. But he got an enormous amount of press. And he also released a lot of propagandic imagery. It's perhaps easier to study Luther as a political reformer than a religious one. Not everyone will agree with me on this, but it's perhaps easier to do that because some of the tactics that he used really didn't seem to sit with the heart of Christian doctrine. I mean, okay, it's not his fault he got kidnapped by Frederick the Wise, but he did not return out of custody in that castle until there were riots happening in Wittenberg, which is where he was a professor and had purportedly kick-started this movement. There was a rising iconoclasm, which is essentially the orderly or disorderly distrust and removal of sacred images. You only have to go to the classic Ten Commandments to find a pretty clear instruction, in the Old Testament at least, that God didn't want to be worshipped through images, and that he didn't want people to involve images in their worship. So you'll find that one of his fellow lecturers at Wittenberg, Karlstadt, was his surname, had a long name, was very passionate about this return to a truer form of their faith expression that didn't involve the use of images, and he was stirring up the people to have images removed. Now, Luther, whilst he was in protective custody, and I've left a lot of the story out for you because it's well known, you can go and you can delve into why he was hiding from the Catholic powers yourself. He returns from that to Wittenberg, purportedly to calm things down, and he puts an end to an already mandated order from the local council to remove images. Now you might think, okay, that sounds balanced, that's fair, but something surprising. I can't judge him outside of his time, but something that completely rocked me when I went to Wittenberg was one of the images on the town church there. There is this, they call it the Jewish pig. If you have any sensitivity towards the Jewish people, you'll appreciate the depth of this insult. But they have this pig with a character who looks like a Jewish rabbi staring up its anus, with a bunch of little half pig, half Jew Julets, anyway, suckling from the breasts of this pig. And it's got words to the effect of the wisdom of the rabbis. It is the most horrendous insult that I've seen. I thought J.K. Rowling's Mudbloods in her Harry Potter series was an incredible slur and powerful insult, but this Jewish pig thing is horrendous. It makes you want to vomit. It causes problems even now, but it was pre-existing before Luther's time, and it may give you a bit of an insight into, I don't know, like racial relations during that era. But if they had gone ahead with the removal of images, which happened in other parts of the Reformed European Church, this image, amongst many others, would have been removed. And yet it stayed. So Luther's defense of images in worship allowed this horrendous image to stay, where it stays to this day on the side of the town church in Wittenberg. There are calls to take it down. I met a pastor from the United States who had a very poignant message about it. He said that in his culture, he had an awareness that they had a lot of monuments to hatred, and that they needed to be taken down, and they were starting to take them down. And as we speak, it's 2018 in the US, he doesn't think they should be destroyed. He said we need to take them down and put them somewhere where they can be remembered, because we need to remember our sins and repent of them. And that's an interesting attitude towards it. But the Jewish pig on the side of the church in Wittenberg, along with some of the images which Luther has his own signature on that he published, are signs that are truly shocking, and it's a letdown to him that in later days he published some very unhelpful remarks about Jewish people. And if you know anything about later German national history, they shouldn't really be in a position to be making statues of someone who has such poor opinion of the Jewish people. Fortunately, there's statues of Luther in every town he had anything to do with. So this is why I say it's worth more to look at him as a political figure than as a religious figure, even though a religious figure indeed he was. There are many people attached to the Christian church who are connected to his tradition. But a great thing that he contributed in balance for some of his tolerance of I'm going to say tolerance of hatred, but you can debate me on that in the comments if you like. He translated the Bible into the German language. That heavily influenced later translations into the English language, etc., French. But he did a great work in allowing people to access and determine for themselves the dynamics of the Christian faith. Now, whether you're a Christian or not, if you look at it politically, he was allowing people to have access to information that was vital to them, and to make informed choices moving forward. He was later hijacked by the nationalist movement, and that explains all of the statues, and you can find some odd posters throughout history, one of Luther and Otto von Bismarck standing underneath the oak tree where he apparently burned the papal bull which proclaimed him a heretic. Leaders of the German people jumped on the Luther train, and I found at this great exhibition they had at the Wartburg Castle an example of a poster which said something like, "With Luther and Hitler, some positive effect would come about." My German's not great, so I'd have to take time to translate it. But incidentally, the German churchman who published this this propagandic poster lost his post on account of it. So it's not. I'm not trying to make out that all of Germany is on board with Luther at his worst, but many of the Germanic people were on board with him at his best, and he's a man who leaves such a mark on history. It can't be explained as being purely his own doing. He was fated. Nobody deserves that much attention, and he ran into his own quandary in that whilst he was talking about the freedom of a Christian and the capacity to be justified by faith, and essentially to have this freedom in God's kingdom, we see the rise, perhaps in response to some of the ideas that he's circulating, of what came to be known as the German Peasant War. And it happened, forgive me if I'm wrong, somewhere around 1525. Essentially, we saw an early modern uprising of people who weren't satisfied to then remain with the status quo, and they wanted to take some power into their hands. Luther did not side with the rebelling peasants, and he wrote some fairly stern, harmful remarks condemning them, encouraging their stern chastisement, indeed slaughter. Many people died in the German peasants' revolt, and Luther is not remembered as a hero in that cause, but incidentally, there was another reformer who did side with them, and didn't end well for him. But he at least has been commemorated in history. If you go to Wittenberg, you'll find an exhibition sort of celebrating him as the people's champion. And if you tie in the post World War II communist era, in the DDR, you can see people stretching back into the past to find their nationalist heroes, and that's why I think it's good to look at the Reformation as a rise of nations. Now, what else can I give you to support that? Well, Luther didn't necessarily start the Reformation. In fact, he tied imagery in with an earlier reformer called Jan Hus, who was from what is now the Czech Republic. Back then it was Bohemia. In 1415, Jan Hus was burned in the town of Constance along with his works after, there's a long story behind it, but basically he turned up in Constance to defend himself to the church because they said that he was propagating the heresy of an earlier known English heretic, John Wycliffe, who came from a century before. You can go back that far if you want to look for roots of the Reformation. But Hus had his own gripe against the sale of indulgences and the cult of saints, and I don't want to get into all of the theology, like I said. thing that's important about Jan Hus, and I stood in the place where he stood when he was condemned. That was chilling in that church still there. He was burned as a heretic, and he brought with him signed statements by the nobles and the people of substance in his home country, and they were saying that they supported him. Now that was ignored by this council that had come together in Constance, and partly ignored to their peril, because a few short years later the Hussites, or the people of Bohemia, actually revolted against the broader Catholic rule, and they repelled something like 5 attempts to bring them back under military control. So they retained a political independent freedom, one which was later resolved into a sort of pluralistic Christian society, at least, where Catholics or the Reformed Hussites could live and do business together in a country. And this before the horrors of the 30 Years' War, which was a result of the Reformation. Also, make a point that this European Reformation seems to forget the rest of the world. There's certainly no reference to Australia or the Americas at this point, that we can get to that at a later point. In the east of Europe, you have the origins of the church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, which isn't really given it's not even given a look in on the debate. The Ottoman Turk Empire has sort of exploded and taken over all of those regions, is a real threat to Western Europe at that time. But inside the territories ruled by the Ottoman Turks, you see a tolerance where if people practiced a Christian faith, they're not exterminated. They're allowed to continue to practice it. They're just expected not to proselytize. They're expected not to try and take people from other religions and convert them to theirs. But they are allowed to continue. Indeed, if you've played some war games, you may know of that gunpowder unit, the Janissaries. Janissaries were in fact Christian. What's the right word for them? Conscripts, yes, who are working under the Ottoman Turk Empire. It's a side note, but my point is that you've got Muslims and Christians coming to some kind of medium. There's new society forming, and there's tolerance happening, whilst Christianity itself in Western Europe is pulling itself apart. Other examples of the rising nationalism: the Holy Roman Empire rules the now Germany, Switzerland, parts of France, like a big chunk of Europe at the time. But it's a loose confederation of city-states and regions which they swear fealty to an emperor, but there's the infighting. Frederick the Wise keeping Luther alive against Catholic rulers' wishes is an example of the kind of camps and divisions that there are in there. But the Swiss Confederacy has already emerged by the year 1500. Remember, 1517 is supposedly the start of the Reformation. But the Swiss Confederacy has an autonomous independence from the Holy Roman Empire by this stage. Zurich, other towns, Bern, I'll have to read it out of a book to tell you, but Zurich I've been to, and the Alpine regions around there. A man who comes from that region, Ulrich Zwingli. Now he didn't originate in Zurich; he was born up in the mountains. And I've been to the house. Where he was born, where he was raised. That was exciting. I went to the house Luther was born too. But Ulrich Zwingli is this like Luther is the German national. He's like the Ned Kelly. Luther is the Ned Kelly of early Germany, and that'll help Australians to refer. And Zwingli is like a Ned Kelly figure of the Swiss Confederacy of Switzerland. More so, he dies on a battlefield defending Protestant states from their Catholic neighbours. But Zwingli is right there at the outset. It happens in his lifetime that the Swiss build this reputation for themselves on the battlefield, and he's at a very significant battle in Swiss history. God damn it, I've forgotten the name of it. It's something like Marignon. Anyway, the forces of the Italian princes, the Pope in particular, are fighting against the forces of the French. He was a king or he was an emperor. Anyway, Francis I was the king in this battle, and he was actually on the battlefield, and he faced off against Swiss soldiers, like 20,000 of them. He tried to buy them off, but fresh ones arrived and they didn't like the deal, so this fight emerged. And the Swiss were fighting on behalf of the Pope, essentially, Pope Leo X, the same Pope who Martin Luther squared off against. But you've got to understand that Martin Luther didn't have a problem with Leo, even though Leo himself was criticised for having too much interest in the arts and not enough in society. Try and remember the Renaissance is happening at the same time as the Reformation. So all those great artists, Michelangelo, just think of the Ninja Turtles. Those guys, right? That's all happening at the same time. But Zwingli is part of this battle, which the Swiss could have won, probably should have won, even though they were outnumbered 2-1. They had this tactic, this legendary status, the Swiss pikemen, where the infantry would rush the guns of the opponents, take over the guns, turn them around, and use them against their opponents. The Swiss were legends on the battlefield. They had won battles in recent history. Some of the same men who'd won those previous battles were on that field that day. They had determined to fight a force that was twice their size, that consisted of cavalry and artillery, with infantry, and they could have won. Anyway, the point is they lost. In fact, they lost more than half of their number. One of the people who survived that battle was Ulrich Zwingli, who was a field preacher. He was a military chaplain. But you've got to understand that, like the World War I type chaplain who doesn't carry a gun, that he's not that kind of chaplain. Zwingli carries a sword, okay? So he does his share of stabbing, but he's there to administer to those who are near to death. So he has a comfortability with a theology of war. Zwingli recognizes, I'm jumping ahead, the Swiss to this day attribute the loss on that battlefield as the reason why they have this ongoing neutrality. Why are Swiss neutral? Well, they say because they lost over 10,000 men at that battle, and they swore after then never to get involved in the wars of foreign kings or foreign states. That did not stop them from conscripting their troops out for foreign service as mercenaries, and in fact the Pope to this day is protected by a Swiss guard. So it didn't end the military history of Switzerland. It just it created this international politic. They had this new foreign policy. Switzerland probably couldn't have maintained that if they didn't have these giant castle-like mountains defending their homeland. And you only need to compare the fate of Switzerland with the nearby, perhaps, Rhineland in, well, in the Holy Roman Empire, which suffered a lot in the 30 Years' War which emerged. But Zwingli comes home from that battle a vocal opponent of foreign military service, indeed, of the mercenary cause, but he sees a need for change. Now, let's not forget that Zwingli was fighting in the name of the Pope at the time. So when he emerges as somebody who eats sausages or allows sausages to be eaten on a Holy Friday, or speaks out against images or various forms of Catholic worship and reshapes the Christian religion, he's reshaping it with a view towards independence and nationalism, and dies on a battlefield at Capelle in 1531 defending, they call this the Second Battle of Capelle, because he actually was involved in initiating a preemptive strike where a peace was struck on a battlefield with their enemies, but that didn't hold, and they end up getting attacked anyway. He dies defending his Protestant faith or his political sphere. He's a statesman. Zwingli is a statesman. And perhaps another example of the political nature of the Reformation is the other great renowned reformer, Jean Calvin, who was a Frenchman who sort of, by just association with a guy who preached a perhaps too Protestant sermon in Paris, basically finds himself having to leave because it's not politically, or let's say it's just not safe to stay. So he wants to go to Strasbourg, and has already published, a pretty interesting piece. He's a lawyer. He's been trained as a lawyer. He's published a pretty interesting piece on the Christian faith, and just gets roped into staying at Geneva, where they've declared themselves reformed, but they need help. The Catholic Church was not just responsible for the faith of the people, but in a lot of times you would have them responsible for the legal system in a region. So minus Catholic support, all of the training and expertise around the rule of law is gone. So Jean Calvin is not a priest, unlike Zwingli and Luther was a monk, and Zwingli was a priest. Calvin was never ordained, even though he had a lot to do with shaping a branch of the Christian religion, but he was a lawyer, and so the legalism of Calvin is attributed to the fact that that's what he was. He was a lawyer, he was a politician, and at one point he's expelled from Geneva by people who resented having this foreign guy, this French guy, telling them how to do things. So this gets us back to politics. These Genevans, they didn't like having this French man there, so they kicked him out, and he went and spent some happy years in Strasbourg, where he wanted to be. But then they called him back because it was hard to work stuff out without legal expertise. So Calvin came back. What I love about a sad thing about Calvin's story, he's criticised for having supported or allowed the execution of another Christian heretic. I'm going to put his name on the screen because it's escaped me. It starts with an S. But people are like, oh, how could one heretic burn another heretic? Well, he was a politician, and as a statesman, let's not judge too harshly. We still have the death penalty in plenty of places in the world today. So Calvin's easy to judge, but let's go softer on him and remember he wasn't even a churchman. He was not trained as a priest. He was trained as a lawyer. But one of the many people who came and formed this international community of learning in Geneva while Jean Calvin was there was the Scottish reformer John Knox, who had been an Anglican priest, so far as you were able to be an Anglican priest, but had worked himself into captivity by the French at one point, spent 2 years a slave on a French galley, and was just too fiery an Anglican to survive the tumultuous things that were going on in England, in the late 1540s. So he ends up having to go to the continent. He doesn't even settle in Frankfurt for long enough to find a proper home. So he ends up in Geneva. And when I was in Geneva, I found this beautiful it's this tiny little chapel besides the big cathedral there. Interesting side note to compare the difference between the German cathedrals and the Swiss churches, and in Geneva in particular, where Calvin was strongly present. What I was talking about, iconoclasm, there really is a removal of the images, the statues, and all the paintings and whatnot. They're clean and clear places of worship, very similar and obviously heavily influential on the churches of Australia, particularly the Presbyterian church where I worship. So I stood in what a dual national Australian-Swiss guy told me was the first Presbyterian church of the world, and this is where he said that that Calvin and Knox hammered out the theology of, indeed, the liturgy of what would become the Presbyterian Church. And this is because the couple of hundred English refugees who were in Geneva at the time needed a place of worship, and they were the Genevans were obliging to allow them to worship, but they wanted to make sure that the form of worship that was happening was not offensive to the other people. What I've got here is an awesome, in my mind, book which gives you the actual liturgy of those services. And a really interesting point is that it's published in English on one side, excellent old-timey English, and then in Latin on the other. Now, the reason why it's published in Latin is so that those who wanted to see what's going on in this worship service of theirs, who couldn't speak English, could check up on it. And basically, if you read through, now I'm an English speaker, my French is poor and my German's worse. For me, this document here was the find of 5 centuries, because I could jump into the Reformation and read in English exactly what's going down. So I wanted to make something of a point out of this, because when I was told that Calvin and Knox are hammering out the form of that religion, you've got to remember that you know, Calvin's burned a known heretic at the stake, and he's allowed these English Christians to celebrate their religion and indeed hold a service in the little chapel beside the cathedral every Sunday, but it needs to be one that doesn't cause offence to the Christian community, but also in respect of the culture that's forming. Because remember, I'm talking about rising nationhood, and that's essentially what's going on here. If I can find the exact quote from the Sunday morning service, I'll give you a true example in English about the Reformation really being about nations. So listen to this prayer that John Knox and a panel of others have put together. Their Sunday morning service starts with a confession of our sins, framed to our time out of the 9th chapter of Daniel. O Lord God, which art mighty and dreadful, thou that keepest covenant and showest mercy to them that love thee and do thy commandments, we have sinned, we have offended, we have wickedly and stubbornly gone back from thy laws and precepts. We would never obey thy servants the prophets that spoke in thy name to our kings and our princes, to our forefathers, and to all the people of our land. Our Lord, righteousness belongeth unto thee, unto us pertaineth nothing but open shame, as it is come to pass this day, unto our miserable country of England. Yea, unto all our nation, whether they be far or near, through all lands wherein they are scattered, for the offences that they and we have committed against thee. Okay, do we focus on the theology or do we focus on the politics? John Knox has been thrown out of England, and he's got England in the heart of his service. They're holding a service in Geneva in English, and he's identifying the people of that nation as being still English if they're anywhere in the world. So there's this connection to culture that is emerging, and once you put people's faith services into their own language and let them hold meetings wherever they are in the world in their own language, read the Bible in their own language and pray in their own language, the language starts to tie people together, and you get this rise of nations. And that rise of nations is, in fact, could we say positive? Certainly ongoing outcome of the Reformation. So, are you a Christian? Maybe you are, maybe you aren't. But do you have something that you owe to these reformers? Well, do you like your nation? Do you enjoy the security that a nation brings? I don't want to get into that whole argument now, because there are alternative structures in the world. But whatever benefits nations bring, they were starting to work out the politics of that during the time of the Reformation. It was a push against foreign hegemony, this influence of others over the day-to-day, the taxes and the rituals and just the forms of life, essentially forms of governance. Now, Knox himself got himself some critics by he actually published material which in his aspect supported people's rights to change their ruler if their ruler wasn't right before God. The capacity for people to change their rulers emerges later in history as something that actually becomes successful on people's behalf. The German peasants' revolt was squashed, and uh, was it the Peace of Augsburg that basically said whose realm, his religion? The 30 Years' War, which killed about 8 million people in Europe, and it was depressing in Berlin to see this wonderful exhibit which just seems to come back to weapons, and it was the same everywhere I went. European history just comes back to cannons at one point or another. But Knox himself, who's commemorated in a very large and wonderful a monument in Geneva, also a big one in Worms. He's an early modern thinker, and that's what's often forgotten when people are dealing with these reformers, because if you snub Christianity, if you think that the church has done great wrongs, these people thought that. They were just involved in it. They weren't willing to give up completely on the idea of faith. They thought faith and culture was entwined, and so that they were doing the best they could. But hey, John Knox himself says, we have sinned, we have offended, we have done wickedly and stubbornly gone back. The reformers were keenly aware of their faults. I was angry when I went to Europe and started seeing the legacy of violence and hatred there. It was hard. It was confronting. There's castles broken down on the skyline. Napoleon destroyed a lot. People seem to erect towers to whatever's important to them. And in Europe, you've got these great cathedral towers in Strasbourg, this wonderful Notre Dame, 400 years in the making. A cathedral dominates the skyline, and castles dominate the skylines of hills at times of Europe's history. And in today's day and age, commercial towers dominate the skyline. It's hard not to feel the echo from Scripture of that Tower of Babel that God intervenes and warns against, because this erection of a tower, he doesn't see it in that context of history as a good thing for humans to do. But look, the reformers are aware of their faults, and they're aware of the faults of their culture, and they're working to fix it. Now, there's a catch cry that they still have emblazoned large in Geneva, which is post tenebris lux, after darkness light. And if we want to be helpful in history and helpful in our culture, we need to be looking, yes, darkness, towards light at the other end. And that's what we can learn from the reformers. Always reform. Reform your religion? No. Reform your culture. Reform yourself, but reform your culture. And let's take it right back to Jesus now, when he was challenged by his rivals whether people should pay taxes. He said to them, "Why are you tempting me? Give me a coin. What's this tax biz? Give me a coin." So they give him a coin, and he goes, whose face is on this coin? And they're like, "It's Caesar's face." He's like, "Well, then you give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and you give to God what is God's." Jesus drew a line down the middle and understood that, yeah, okay, we need government of men, and that should not impede your ability to have a profitable relationship with your Creator, to be something, part of something more than yourself. So the pursuit of religion does not have to mean civil unrest, and Christ himself knew that. Now, whilst I'm winding up, if I could finish on a particularly happy note, I've got to dig out this artifact, that awesome exhibition I went to in Berlin, which really got to the guts of the effects of Protestantism. Perhaps it pointed out how little the Europeans learned. They didn't want hegemony, they didn't want foreign control, but then when they took their faith out to the world, to the Americas, to Africa, eventually to Australia, they kind of squashed the cultures that were there. But these clever German historians pointed out that even in Europe, like the Sami people in the north of Sweden, were persecuted for being different. White people being persecuted by white people. White people did it to themselves before they did it to the other indigenous people of the world. We should remember that. Okay, indulgences. They were some form of currency. You'll see here a €0 note. This is a genuine note from the European Bank, and this €0 note has Martin Luther on the other side, and it says Gottes Gnade gib es umsonst. Okay, I told you my German's bad, but I did ask this German family in Wittenberg if they could translate that for me. And whilst the father's telling me, oh, you can't change one word for another, and that's a terrible accent, but he was struggling with the translation. His 12-year-old son whips out an iPhone and Google Translate, and he goes, grace. He goes, God's grace is a free gift. And I was like, yeah, all right, cool, thanks, man. So here we have, to wrap up the Reformation, I have a $0 note, a €0 note. I can't exchange this note for anything. It's free, but I found it to be the most poignant example of us moving forward. I forgot to mention the people who, speaking of zero, had zero involvement in politics at the time. The Anabaptists, I went to this cave in the Swiss Alps where people travelled to the ends of the earth to escape the craziness of what was happening politically and just try and live a Christian faith outside of culture. You'll know their descendants today as the Amish people in the United States, and you see they live outside of culture and outside of time, those people, oh dear, I'm talking and getting excited and I'm putting folds in my $0 note. Those people, that cave that they were in had an odd shape to it, like the eye of a dragon. It was quirky to be in there. We sang a psalm in there which was good, and I had this sort of baptism underneath the waterfall that came off the mountain. It was cool. What else did I do while I was there? I lay in an ancient bishop's grave. He wasn't using it, and became a lay bishop. That was cool. And I stood underneath the statue, the big chair with only 3 legs outside the United Nations, which is trying to tell us about civilian casualties of landmines, and I was, for a moment, the leg of that chair. What am I getting at? God's gift of grace is free. You can engage in history, and then you can become part of it, become something bigger than yourself. You don't have to lay in graves and get baptized under alpine waterfalls to achieve that. You just need to show some kindness to the people next to you, some understanding and some acceptance. And guess what? You don't have to make them think the way you do, and you don't have to agree with them. You just have to be caring and sharing with them. It's that simple. So, what have we learned from the Reformation? Love the people next to you and work together. Don't try and force each other into the same way of thinking. Accept each other's differences. Freely accept. Have a free exchange with the people next to you. That's what we need to carry forward into the future. Can we 500 years from now be celebrating an achievement of humanity in that regard? I want so. I hope so. Jesus promised us the kingdom of heaven is inside, okay? The sky kingdom is inside of us. Get it together, humans. We can make heaven on earth. That's God's free gift. Make it happen.